Welcome to this fun tutorial that I call Cheek to Cheek. More of a landscape so that we can move into all different subject matter. I did do a little bit of miscutting, just some of the cowtails and the fence posts so that I could keep them clean and fresh. So of course you're going to be using miscut today. You'll be using some salt today. And you're going to be using 3 round brushes, your nice big number 8 or 10, a number 4, and a number 2. You're also going to be using both riggers, your regular number 1 rigger and a very fine liner. The colors that we're going to be using cadmium red. We will be using some burnt sienna, which is your nice warm brown. We're also going to be using some alizarin crimson, and that alizarin crimson you will be mixing with your sienna to get your dirt color for your road, so you will be using that alizarin crimson. We're also going to be using the darker brown, which is burnt umber. We're going to be using our yellow ochre. And if you don't have yellow ochre, you can always use cad yellow, but I do like the yellow ochre for the grasses. We'll be using a lot of sap green, so you want to make sure you have a lot of sap green handy. We'll be using our usual black, especially for those cow butts, so make sure you have some nice good black. We're also going to be using some nice cerulean blue. If you don't have cerulean blue, you can use ultramarine blue, but I like the nice sky blue in the cerulean blue. So have your colors ready, and we'll begin. I'm going to begin by painting all of the sap green in, all of my greenery. So I am just using some sap green. While it is wet, I will be dropping in some additional coloring, both some umber, a little bit of yellow ochre, and I want to place it in specific areas. So I'm placing a lot of my coloring near my fence posts or along the edge of the road. I'm also using some of my additional coloring to show the sloping landscape. So while my sap is nice and wet, I'm adding in those additional colors, and then I'm going to be doing some salting. Make sure that you dry brush your edges off so that it looks like the grass has been growing high in some areas. I did that both in front of that little farm building, but also along the edge of the road. And you want to be careful as to how you have that dry brushing go. You don't want your dry brushing to be vertical along the edge of the road where it is directly in front of you, because you want that grass to be growing out onto the road. farther towards the back of the picture where you don't see where the grass would be growing onto the road so much, then I made my dry brushing vertical. So you want to be careful as to how you place your dry brushing, but you do want to bring that dry brushing out onto the actual road. You're going to continue the same thing on the other side of the road, same coloring, your sap green, and then I dropped in some additional coloring while it was wet, and I did some salting. You're going to allow that to dry really well, and then you'll remove your salt so that we can work on the road. The road portion is done with a mixture of burnt sienna and a little bit of alizarin crimson. And I watered that down pretty well. I'm going to paint that in and paint that up into my dry brushing area. It's okay if you paint over the edge a little bit, you'll just get a hard line, but that's perfectly fine. I'm not doing any salting or anything on my original wash of the road, just strictly my sienna and my alizarin crimson. I used a bigger brush for the middle of the road and then used my smaller round to get in close to the areas into my dry brushing. Some of my areas along the dry brushed edge, I added in some additional coloring, some additional more intense coloring, just to change up the color slightly. But even if you don't do that, that's something that can be done once this wash dries. Now I'm going to start to put some of the coloring in my little farm shack. I used some cerulean blue for the one whole window because the framing will be darker. And then I just placed some of the cerulean blue in where individual windows will be once I get everything painted in. Now I'm going to begin to paint my cows, and I'm going to be painting them in one at a time because with them being so close together, it's very easily done that you can confuse them. So I am painting one cow at a time in totality, meaning I'm using the sienna color for the udders, and then I'm painting in the black spots. Once that is completed on all of the separate cows, then I'm going to go back in and do all of my shadowing on each individual cow so that when I'm finished, my cows will be totally done. The udders are burnt sienna, and while some of the sienna was wet, I went to the base of the udder and dropped in a little bit of watered down black just to go ahead and already put some soft shadowing in that area. The black parts of the cow are simply that. They're just regular black. I didn't water it down too much because I wanted the black color to be more intense. But again, I'm working on one cow at a time so that it doesn't get too confusing. Take your time. They don't have to be painted exact, but these are black and white milk cows, so they have a lot of spotting or sections of their whole body that are nice and black. To go back in and separate the cows out later, that will be done with a little bit of shadowing. So just make sure that you have all of your cows totally painted in how you want them with the black. We want that black coloring to be dried nice before we start going back in and shadowing a little bit, because most of the shadowing is going to be done just on the legs and the undersides of the cows. There's not a lot of shadowing on top because that's where your light source is. The only little bit of shadowing might be to help to separate them out a little bit. But other than that, there's very little shadowing on the tops of the cows. Now, once your cowls are all totally painted in, then you're going to go back in and shadow them. Again, the underside of your cowls, there can't be any pure white because there's no light that can get down in between those cows and up under their bellies. So most of their legs are all shadowed. There might be a little bit of white here and there, but all of the bellies, the underbellies, and all of the legs are pretty much in great shadow. I did not take the misket off of my tails yet, and I will paint those tails in separately a little bit later on, but I wanted to make sure that I had all of my shadowing done. I'm going to also do my shadowing on my road because underneath all of those cowls, the road has to be shadowed because there's no light getting in down there. They are walking so closely together that all of those shadows on the road are caused by that big constant circle of cows walking down the road. So if you look at your picture, you'll see where all of that shadowing is underneath the cows on the road.
Was it to hear her describe a cold-blooded murder? To a 13-year-old girl saying that she took part in this brutal murder, they were dumbfounded. Hi, I'm Paul Jones. Tonight, we're on the case in Sonoma, California, 32 miles outside of San Francisco. It was here, on the side of a likely traveled canyon road, that a terrifying mystery began with the discovery of a lifeless body. When first responders arrived, they were stunned by the violence unleashed on a 14-year-old girl. As the investigation unfolded, police would have to analyze shocking stories and sift through puzzling evidence to try to solve one of Alameda County's most notorious homicides. December 2nd, 1983. The sun just set over the Sonoma Hills in California when a motorist heading home along a canyon road noticed something odd out of the corner of his eye. As he drove by, did he make sense of what he saw? He thought he saw someone laying on the side of the road, and it wasn't until he got out of his car when he realized this was the body. The motorist raced to the scene and made this chilling call to 911. Emergency workers were dispatched to the scene. The first to arrive was firefighter Ken Hale. That moment remains etched in his memory 39 years later. This is where we found the body of the young girl. She was partially clothed and had a plastic bag tied over her head. It appeared that the victim, a teenage girl, had been killed. What was the condition of the victim's body? She looked like she'd been badly beaten. She had a open skull fracture. She had a deep laceration under her chin. Despite her gruesome injury, Ken Hale wasn't certain she was dead. Did you think there was any hope that you'd be able to resuscitate her? The victim was still bleeding. As long as there was even a fraction of a chance that she was going to survive, she was going to get treated like she had that chance. Hale immediately went to work. He had to remove the wire that had been wrapped tightly around the victim's neck. It was holding a garbage bag in place over her head. I cut that off, removed the bag. Hale then discovered a red silk necktie that appeared to have been used to strangle the teenager. It was tied around her neck from the back. cut that off. I tried to take a carotid pulse. I got nothing. I said, we're starting CPR now. I was trying to save her. Kale knew that his chances for success were slim. Giving up was never an option. Over your career, you've responded to countless tragedies. What is it about the circumstances of this case that haunts you to this day? My wife and I were right in the middle of trying to have children at the time, and I just could not understand how anybody could do that to a little girl. Was there anything at the scene that could help you identify the victim? No, she had no ID. When we put her in the ambulance and shipped her to the hospital, I did not know who she was. Despite Ken Hale's heroic efforts, the teenager was declared dead minutes later. The case was officially a homicide investigation. What was the victim wearing?
She had a blue track jacket. It had red stripes down the sleeves. She had a red and white blouse on, blue jeans, and just one shoe.
Crime scene investigators began to process the scene, starting with the garbage bag. It had been tied over the victim's head.
Inside that brown bag, there was a shopping bag. It was white. The writing on it said CNBC shopping bag.
There was also a blood-soaked sweater. Investigators didn't believe that it belonged to the victim.
The sweater was also inside this large brown bag that was over her head.
Make sure you get some of those shadows a little bit darker as it gets into the middle of the cluster of those cows. And also, don't forget to paint in your man. Paint in all of his clothing, his boots. His flesh tone is the same color as the road. Basically, I may have put in a little bit more sienna on his flesh tones. But you can paint his clothing whatever color you would like, and make sure that you get a shadow under him also.
This doesn't go through anywhere. There's nothing on that road.
Investigators theorized the killer hadn't even stopped the car and may not have been alone. Her body was twisted. It looked quite like she had been thrown out of the vehicle. To actually throw somebody out of a vehicle takes more than one person. Somebody has to drive, and somebody has to do the throwing. Although police weren't certain about the number of perpetrators, the motive of the crime seemed obvious. Did investigators believe that a sexual assault had been committed? The autopsy results confirmed much of the detective's theory.
Now I need to dirty up the road a little bit because the road is much too smooth and much too clean. So I mixed that same color of the road, added a little bit more alizarin to it, and a little bit more black to it, and I'm painting the whole foreground with that so that I can throw some salt on it. I'll soften the edge with some water. I will put more color into the wet paint if I feel that I need it, if I want to make it darker, and then I'm going to throw some salt on that. So make sure you've dirtied it up, make sure it's nice and wet, and then you can throw some salt on it. You're going to use that same color then and go along the edge of the road, dry brushing if you want, softening the edge if you want, and definitely dry brushing a big, long, thick stripe down the middle of the road going towards the distance. You want to make that nice and dirty and rocky and stony. So you want to add your color, make sure you put in enough color, throw your salt on, Add some along the edge of the road where you feel you might need it, and then definitely that nice big wide stripe going down the center of the road towards the end of the road. Now I'm going to re-wet the right side below my posts and below my lighter color that I washed in there. I'm going to wet it with water because I want to add a dark stripe into that. And that dark stripe is going to be sap mixed with some black. I'm going to add that in, allow it to bleed into the water. If I have to, I can dry brush upwards or downwards, and then I'm going to re-salt that because I want some more texturing in that. But you want to make sure you have a nice wet line there so that this dark paint has room to move and blend and bleed and soften itself. I'm going to go back up and do a little bit more on my little farmhouse. I'm going to dry brush the top to that house just with a little bit of watered down cerulean mixed with some black. I'll paint in the door, paint in the windows, paint in that wood piece that's on the roof and in front of the front of that old shed. You can pick your colors accordingly as to what you would want, but you would want ahead and start working on these little details now here and there. Now I'm going to start to do some of my shadowing to show how that hillside comes downwards to that house. So you want to dry brush at an angle because that's the only thing that's going to make your eye realize that house sits way down in. It's not flat. So continue to dry brush anywhere that you feel that you need some dry brushing to help to show the lay of the land. You want to make sure, even just by dabbing your brush around, you're showing tufts of grass or areas where maybe the ground has sunk in a little bit, but that all adds to this picture. Your picture and see where you might need some little spaces or little blots with your brush, little side strokes to kind of break things up. I went under where my salting worked really well to kind of make it look like, that was a bunch of fuzzy bushes, but you don't have to do that. Around this hole, I'm kind of dry brushing at an arc to make it look like that hole sits down in also, so that you kind of have to go up and over to get down into that area. So there's a lot of little things that you can do with your brush to make it look like the land is not flat. Dry brush on the other side. If you have any lines that are too smooth and you know that that's not how it should look, then dry brush those edges off to make it look more realistic. Start to put in any details, shadowing above or under the overhang of the roof in your house. You can do some additional greenery if you feel that you need some greenery anywhere. You can add all of that stuff in, but you want to go ahead and do that while you're waiting for something to dry or while you're, contemplating where else you might need something. If a place looks too plain or it looks like it needs something added, then I'm sure it does. And go ahead and add those couple brush strokes in or whatever is necessary. But just make sure that none of your grasses or none of your fields look nice and smooth. They are not nice and smooth. They're rough. There's grasses that are high, there's weeds, there's stones. So you want to make it look like that, nice and rough. Okay, you're going to remove your misket on your tails now, and then you're just going to paint those tails in. Some are black and white, some are sienna colored. You decide what colors you want on your cow's butts. But you want to make them stand out too. That's why we misketed them. So even if you paint them the same color, they're going to have that hard line and you'll be able to see their tails much better. So decide ahead of time what painted tail colors you want. Stick with your blacks, your grays, and your siennas. When you're done with your tails, then go ahead and finish the details in your house, your window panes, your window colors, and then remove all of the misting from your fence posts. I painted my fence posts with some watered down black mixed with some cerulean blue to give them a gray color. But while they were wet, I added in some sienna. I added in a little bit of umber. And then, still while they were wet, I went ahead and on the left side posts, I shadowed the right side of the post. And on the right side posts, I shadowed the right side of the posts because your light source is coming from the left. So you want to make sure that you get the right shadowing in on your posts. Don't spend a lot of time on these. They're not close enough that you see wood grain or anything like that. Just paint them in as simple lines. Now you're going to add some shadowing into the grass, not on every post. I picked out a couple where there was the most grass and I shadowed to the right of the post because again your light source is coming from the left. So just with the side of my brush, I put in some nice thin watered down black shadow lines. And if you really want to get detailed, then with a real fine brush, I drew in some wires, but only on the posts that are closest to me, because you're not going to see skinny little tiny wires on posts that are a quarter mile down the road. Adding some more detail. Any of these long poles or anything that you see in the yard that you want to add, of course you can add them, but they are really not even that important. So if you want to leave them totally out, that's fine too. Okay, now you're going to repeat the same process on the right hand side, painting in your poles. Again, you're shadowing the right side because your light source is coming from the left. After you're done painting in your poles or your posts, then you will put a shadow behind them. So that would be to the right of those posts. And again, through the grass, so nice bumpy lines. They don't have to be straight across. And on these, again, if you want to, you can put some very fine wire lines, but the wires would be very difficult to see in something at that distance. Okay, then you're going to remove all of your salt. Take all of your salt off, and after your salt is all removed, any little white spots left from dry brushing, you can go ahead and paint them in. They're probably grass areas. Paint those in with your sap color. If you left any of those little white spots along the side of the road, misketed those. I'm taking my misket off. If any of those little white spots are too big, I'll dirty them in by dry brushing over them with a little bit of watered down black or umber. And that should be it. Look over your picture, make sure you didn't leave anything. Make sure you have enough feet on your cows. You know, there's not just two back feet. So if you forgot to put any of those half front feet in all along the road, you want to make sure you add some. Be very easy to add because they're usually just black because they're all shadowed in and they're dirty. So it shouldn't be that difficult, but just make sure that it looks like you have enough feet to carry all those nice big cow butts down the road. And you're done. Great farm picture. Kind of takes you back to a nice country road, nice country farm. And of course, if you were driving behind them while you were going nice and slow, getting in all those sweet aroma smells. Great picture. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope it brought you back to the simple things in life. And of course, happy painting.